during and within the pandemic, as documented by the Humanitarian Policy Group. We usually, I think of risks as negative, but I do think they can also offer opportunities for change and adaptation and new ways of living, working, and being. So as you said during my introduction, for many years, my focus has been on the causes and consequences of violence against aid workers. And more recently, I've focused more on the nature and scope of attacks on healthcare and also their impact. I also have a project that's looking into the collection and use of data in the humanitarian sector. So in the limited time that I have, and definitely wanting to leave time for discussion, I'm going to focus my remarks on two risks that I see. So the first is violence against aid workers in healthcare, as you might have anticipated. This has long been an issue for humanitarians, dating at least back to the Battle of Solferino in 1859, where Henri Dunant wandered around the battlefield, lamenting the loss and injury he witnessed. And this experience eventually led him to found the Red Cross movement. And in his memoirs, he recounts the need for and the wounding of medics on the battlefield. So going forward almost 2 centuries, more recently, the number of these kinds of attacks on both aid workers and healthcare is increasing. But this story is not quite so straightforward. The numbers of aid workers globally is also increasing. So we don't also have a sense of the number of healthcare workers globally, and it's an unknown. But we do also know that reporting about attacks is getting much better, both within agencies themselves and also more frequent in the media. As a result, we can't definitively say that the rate of attacks is increasing. We also know that security risk management is getting more sophisticated and more effective. But I guess for me, this isn't necessarily the point, whether or not these attacks are increasing, because their impact is substantial for those affected by the violence, for those, for their colleagues, and importantly, for the civilian population. We hear a lot about the deaths and injuries and kidnappings of aid workers, about the bombings of hospitals, which are tragic, but the scale and the cumulative effects of the non-lethal violence, the harassment, intimidation, is perhaps greater than these attacks that get the most mention. Attacks on healthcare, especially during COVID, have been documented by some of my colleagues as part of a research project I'm working on called the Researching the Impact of Attacks on Healthcare, where we're aiming to document some of this. And so I believe that there will be a map link going into the chat for those who are interested in checking that out. I guess here what I want to also mention is what is changing perhaps is who is perpetrating the attacks. We don't know a lot about perpetrators, but we often assume and hear that these attacks are related to the conflict context, the external context, the politicization and militarization of aid. And this definitely happens. But especially during the pandemic, we've also seen rising number of attacks by civilians. We saw this during the Ebola outbreak, both in West Africa and more recently in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But this also occurs outside of pandemics, and that's what the map that I linked to shows, that you have very different kinds of attacks and places of attack if you think about COVID, pandemic, conflict. So it's complex, I guess. And I've long argued for the need to carefully consider what I've called the internal vulnerabilities, the actions, the behaviors of aid workers and aid agencies that can create resentment and lead to violence. And I think in today's world, I would add the influence of social media and misinformation and how it creates both opportunities for communication, but also risk for humanitarians and also for aid agencies. And in the context of the push for localization, for decolonization of the sector amidst allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse and racism, we need to more carefully consider what these internal vulnerabilities mean for the sector and ways forward in terms of how we think about humanitarian action is structured, implemented, and reformed. So the second risk that I will briefly touch upon is that of digital risk. We're all grappling with data protection and privacy concerns in our own lives, and this is especially true for those who are often the object of humanitarian assistance. So just yesterday, Human Rights Watch released a report on UNHCR violations of informed consent with regard to Rohingya data and its use. In the humanitarian sector, we focus a lot on access of affected people to assistance, access to affected populations. And I think we need to consider a third dimension of access that I've written about with a colleague, and that is who has access to the digital data of affected populations, and how does this pose new inadvertent risks? There are many complexities related to digital data risk, related to the regulatory frameworks, which differ from country to country, related to the modes and processes of the data lifecycle from collection all the way through to storage, use, transfer, and even deletion of the data we collect, related to data responsibility and how we ensure that we collect only what we need and that we effectively use what we collect, and then also related to informed consent for these processes with populations who might not have the choice to opt out. So there's a lot of growing resources out there on these topics, but to me, this is an area that deserves further consideration. So I'll end there, and I look forward to our discussions.
Thank you so much, Larissa. That was really timely as well, thinking about a news story I saw pop up yesterday about how UNHCR in Bangladesh had shared Rohingya data with Myanmar, against without properly informed consent. We can come back to that in the chat. Yeah. Excellent. A couple of provocations there. Please, if you're thinking of questions along the way, do put them in the Q&A function in the bottom, and we can field them when it comes to the chat at the end. I'd like to move over next to Mahir. I saw that you were trying your video out. I'm not sure if you're able to be visible and present at the moment, Mahir. It seems as not, I would say. So perhaps while those technological issues, talking of digital issues, are being sorted out, then Belen, please, would you be able to give your 7 to 10 minutes of reflections on these points? Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for the invitation, first of all. I must say, I think I have a different approach to the risk, not necessarily how humanitarian agencies are at risk, but how they reproduce risk for certain populations. So it's important to clarify that I work in academia and I focus on long-term resettlement processes for climate refugees, is that preventive or prior, and I work in the Amazon rainforest, so I analyze the work that's being done by the Ministry of Housing in Peru to relocate populations in the Amazonian rainforest, and how then can those processes be improved over time to assure the long-term sustainability, both socially and environmentally, of the new settlements. So the main challenges that I see for humanitarianism is the focus on which it is built upon. So the approach towards a situation of risk, let's say, for instance, displacement and resettlement due to environmental change, is that it comes from protocols and methodologies that are situated and originated from the perspective of the national or international agencies providing that aid. So these protocols were thought to provide protection to those being affected, but remain too general and tend to not land well on reality, as they do not recognize nor incorporate the diversity and tend to homogenize those beneficiaries. In their efforts to follow universal protocols, they obscure alternative ways of being and also dehumanize migrants or those beneficiaries in quotes. This is the case, for instance, of internally displaced populations in Colombia, as explained by Oslander in Pasquetti and St. Giles' latest publication on displacement and refugees. These populations are reduced to quantitative data, which renders invisible their complex identities, and they receive a one-size-fits-all aid that is seen in nutritional packages, which do not recognize particular diets in different contexts, such as the Marine Coast or Amazonian dishes. So I just wanted to share really quickly 2 images of the work. So this is the populations that have been relocated that I work with in the Amazon rainforest. And the same of this obscuring of different ways of being can be seen in the housing schemes that are built in Peru. The same unit of house is built in the coastal desert or in the cold highlands and the human rainforest. And these houses tend to be too small and built with poor quality, and the layout fails to adapt to the necessities of those that will live in them. So the question that I ask myself is how to rehumanize those receiving aid and how to transform current approaches so that they can integrate these people in decision-making processes. It's imperative to recognize them as people with capacities to adapt, with valid knowledge, and that they demand access to a better future. Top-down initiatives have a poor record of success because of a lack of regard for local community resources, as explained by Anthony Oliver Smith. So planners often perceive the culture of uprooted people as an obstacle to success rather than a resource. So how can we engage then with them? Diversity complicates the delivery of aid as it requires aid to continually change and adapt to people's necessities rather than the other way around. Displacement, particularly of large groups, is too complex of a process. It's impossible to plan in a linear way, and it encompasses too many variables and unexpected outcomes. So an open-ended approach, which includes people affected in the process, is preferable, calling for a more horizontal and multidimensional understanding, which implies greater levels of participation in decision-making processes for those currently undergoing displacement. So in that sense, current approaches could be thought of as violent processes in themselves, as they tend to reproduce and increase both poverty and vulnerability. Materials donations aimed at mere survival that do not contemplate the creation of platforms and means for the recovery of livelihoods seriously limit the possibilities of those receiving aid to reach autonomy and independence from institutional agencies. So in my own work, I struggle with my positionality in that I recognize these limitations, but I also work with institutional frameworks and protocols that restrain the possibilities of producing change. I represent a university which has to remain neutral and in good relations with the government, and also understand the challenges faced by those delivering aid in their own restrictions that go to go beyond certain ways of operating. So what we do, going back to just one more image, if I may, is that we decided to co-produce with the community members spaces in order for them to be able to provide quantitative and qualitative evidence that alternatives to current ways of operating are both possible and beneficial. We work with populations in the construction of community kitchens and community showers and laundries, investing in infrastructure that facilitates the daily work of women who carry a huge load of not remunerated care work. It is not only about capacity building by exploring together different construction methods, but also opening up spaces for alternative ways of governing the commons, and also recognizing and valuing the work of women and their role in society. We argue that people are able to provide their own homes, but are not able to self-provide public services like water, sanitation, and infrastructures like school, hospitals, and spaces for livelihoods. And so humanitarian work should address those spaces which are what conform community and a sense of place. This process involves not only the material construction, but also how those community spaces are governed and maintained, thus working on promoting a sense of citizenship and shared responsibilities. And with COVID-19 is what we saw, there's two main things. First, the quick response of communities to the situation, being able to reach and help each other before even humanitarian aid or the government reach them. So once again, we recognize that there is a huge potential of working with them, rather working on them. And again, what we see is also the acceleration on the other side of the possible negative impacts of having resettlement processes do not recognize their ways of being. So many people had to abandon the houses that were given by the government because they just couldn't stay at home as we were required to do, because they have no access to jobs, water, sanitation, or facilities. So in that sense, I think what we need to do is, once again, bring people in the process from the very beginning. And lastly, in terms of accessibility, I think it's important to recognize the potential of social media. I know we were discussing about the refugees and their data protection being challenged by the recent event, but in Peru, WhatsApp actually has led us to a more significant level of participation. People themselves have to quickly accelerate and appropriate the process and taking care of the facilities that we build together. And it also led people that usually stay quiet in face-to-face workshops to be able to have a voice. And the whole record of it being in the chat also meant that people could participate at different times that better adapted to their own accessibilities and times. So I think there is an opening for the exploration of how then can we engage with people using social media. But again, that requires a feeling of trust and care that's built up during a longer term process. So that will be all. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you so much. And actually a perfect follow-on from much of what Larissa was talking about, from digital infrastructure to material infrastructure, and providing a counterbalance to some of the promises of social media, as well as some of the risks. And I like you raising the really important issue of positionality as well, your own personality within working within these contexts, and something I'm sure that we'll pick up on in the discussions. But before we move to those, and thank you so much for people sharing questions in the Q&A already, do keep them coming in. We will hand over to Mihir for his 10 minutes of reflections. I think you've been able to join us via audio and video now, which is excellent. You're very welcome, please.
Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Good. You can't see me clearly, but it's a kind of ghosty video, but we'll put up with that. There is not much to see. No, thank you very much. It's my great honor to be on this panel and at this summit. And I thank GRIP and University College London and IRDR for this invitation. Jessica, I will focus on the risk that affects both the researchers and the research, and workers and work, because the title was work and research, and the questions are about workers and researchers. So I thought I'll focus where they overlap. And the first question to me is, what risk do humanitarian workers and researchers face in the context of my work, and how are these changing? And I have two overwhelming to me risks in mind to mention. The first risk, and I've mentioned this before some other places, is that I see is the neoliberal economics misguiding the humanitarian work and research ahead. This economics, as we are practicing, has run out of its benefits, not only to the economy, but to the humanitarian sector as well. It can no longer produce growth that can be distributed, growth that is zero risk, and growth that can actually build resilience. So we are operating in an economic system, humanitarian system, which is actually doesn't allow humanitarian work to do what it intends to do. Will this economics turn this humanitarian ecosystem, if I may use that word, into humanitarian industrial complex in very near future? Corporatization, merchandising, relief, benefit, customer feedback, all that would lead us to humanitarian industrial complex. Most of the research is done through bidding. Most of the contracts for humanitarian relief are through bidding and through projects and so on and so forth. The list is long and we can discuss that. So that's my first risk that I see both the researchers and workers facing. The second risk we face is the risk of monoculture humanitarianism at the cost of plurality of humanitarianism. That is becoming all pervasive. So there is only one way of doing humanitarian work, and one way of addressing standards, and one way of doing case study, and one way of evaluating, and one way of monitoring, and also one way of learning, so on and so forth. So what I would like to point out in this risk, that what about the non-Western and other Western, non-Western and other Western approaches to humanitarianism that are overlooked and continue to be overlooked. Non-Western are obvious, the list, and we can discuss that, but also it is assumed that Western culture itself, Western humanitarianism itself is also as if one, and has always been one monolith, and it has not been. So, the other Western traditions, which are so much interesting for non-Western world as well. And I think that risk is that we are overriding that. So those are the two risks that I wanted to point out, the research and researchers, work and workers. The second question that was asked to me is that how has humanitarian work and research changed with COVID-19? And no single donor or the research council of any of the leading humanitarian donor countries or a humanitarian crisis or humanitarian event has changed humanitarian research and work so much in such a short time. And we can't leave that aside. In 1 year, the humanitarian research and work is totally changed. Number one. Second, and this is from point of view of India, but I think I'm globally also, I'm not off the mark. Whatever happened to the virtues of field work and field workers, for example, to the ethnographic approach to humanitarian work, research, as well as other, embedded research, co-creation of knowledge that we wanted to do with the victims and the workers together. So remote participation has become a reality. So not a single humanitarian function, or for that matter, development function, has stopped, even though it is all done remotely or from a distance. And that's something I find it very of great concern. In almost every sector of economy and society, remote and distant methods, tools, and technology has taken over. And so fast, without any examination, no questioning, no cross-checking, it is just taken over. Digital technology is dictating our point of view, our angle to look at. We look at reference frame or frames that we may have, our narration, principles, visions, they are all altered willingly, all of us agreed to fit the digital tools. Has ever before any technology changed humanitarian research and work so much, so irrevocably, so swiftly, and without any questioning? Larissa, may I call it digitalization of humanitarianism? And that as a risk. The third question to me is that what do these risks mean for the future of humanitarian work and humanitarian studies? And I'd like to point out that so much money is poured into COVID-19. Thea told us that there is mistake of $6 billion or pounds or Dutch currency that they are trying to account for. I'm not saying it is swindled or theft, but at least, they don't quite know how to go about it. And more money will come, but in whose pocket this money is ending up? Disaster victims, disaster researchers, disaster workers. Never before so many billionaires are created in one single year from one single humanitarian crisis. In India, and globally, there was a list that Oxfam has come up with of the last year, the new billionaires from the COVID-19 crisis. And what is visible destination of the COVID-19 money? We don't have research, or we are not tracing that humanitarian money where it is going. At the same time, never before, sadly, such a large number of poor informal sector worker, men and women, vulnerable to ill health, have lost so much income for such a long time, assets, and a future in one single year. Just in India, the migration of people back and forth for the large cities very inhumanly threw them out in less than 8 hours, and they went millions of them, and that is world over. So their contribution to the humanitarian tragedy by letting go or absorbing the shock through hunger and pain is tremendous. Therefore, I want to look at the work of what Thea quite rightly pointed out, the feminist economists more carefully to protect humanitarian research and work. Perhaps that's the direction I would like to explore more. Care economy, does it include humanitarian care or not? We need to find out. Donut economy, the gift economy that Daya is, for example, suggesting, and there's a lot of merit to that. The idea of building economy of nurturance. These are the directions that will protect humanitarian research and work and victims. Belen, this is last point. I want to look at, for example, the Ottoman Empire 600 years with care. They had droughts, they had epidemics, they had floods. There's hardly any material for this 600-year-long period covering such large part of Europe, north of Africa, Asia. Hardly anything that we've looked at and we've drawn to use that. Or for example, the Ahoms in Assam and Myanmar and Thailand, for example. How did they deal with floods? And we haven't looked at that, definitely not adequately. Or for that matter, 2000 years of Buddhism in Asia, including India, China, Japan, and many other countries. What are the humanitarian values, visions, responses that this particular way of thinking has offered? What do they have to tell us now about humanitarian values, principles, visions, work, and research? Hardly anything said above is my own or original. It is borrowed from humanitarian workers and researchers and victims across time and location. They have so much to offer. And why should I or you miss out on that? So I have highlighted them as a whole. And I hope that GRIP and UCL IRDR will take above ideas ahead to reduce the risk that humanitarian work and research face. Let me end by saying, Virgin, I have no doubt that it is the women and workers who will offer ways to reduce risk to humanitarian researchers and workers and victims and turn this rapidly accelerating risk into transformational opportunities for the victims and for the all. They will call for taxing the risk producers and paying the risk reducers, which idea perhaps is not quite fully addressed. They will make work and livelihood central to humanitarian action and not relief and social protection alone. And they will ensure recovery that will not only compensate economic loss and damage, but in fact, regenerate ecology, all species together. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mihir, for your contributions and for bringing the panel provocations to a close. So many threads picked up that began in Thea's keynote and were continued with Larissa and Belen. And before I hand over to Thea for a few quick reflections and reactions to that panel, I really encourage everyone in the audience to share their opinions on digitalization and technology and humanitarianism, given that it's come up in all three presentations so far. What are your opinions? Do you think it's a bigger risk and a danger to accountability? or do you think there are some real threads of hope there? But Thea, please, I hand the floor to you for a few quick reflections.
Thanks a lot, Jessica. I've been listening with fascination, and it's really interesting. And again, I share your admiration, because I feel that Mihir has done the job already to bring everything together and to link the themes that we are bringing up. So I can be very quick in many ways, and perhaps where I could add something, that I think I might be slightly more optimistic about the possibilities of remoteness. And Mihir and I know each other for ages, and we are really good friends. And we sometimes have this discussion already, that how about our ecological footprint, and which is of course very different when you're operating in a tiny country like the Netherlands from a huge country like India. But there is something there about remoteness, and about being able to work remotely, and the possibilities of digitalization, which are also in many ways very impressive. I mean, just look at the people we have together here today. I mean, and without having to travel, we can have a meaningful conversation with so many people. But I totally agree that we have to be on the tip of our toes to look at it, and to see the consequences, and to see how it works. Because even if we're not physically present in the field, how can we have meaningful discussions with people in the field? How can participation work? It doesn't need to be me flying to a field area. It can be, if my collaborations are okay, and I can rely and work nicely together with people who are doing that research and sharing the benefits, publish together, make sure that it's not just like a contract, which we now often see, especially in research. We just contract people to do some interviews, we pay them a few bucks, and then we publish. So there's lots of things to do about it, to make it fair, to make it real. And the word fair is very important in digitalization, and it's a vast area to study. I can only say that. Yeah.
Did you hear me properly? I didn't have my thingy in place. Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, good.
We did hear you. Thank you. Thanks so much for that, Thea. That was excellent. And I'd like to. We've had a number of contributions already. Questions come in the Q&A, and a few comments and responses in the chat too. And before I go to the Q&A, do any of you fellow panelists have a quick response or contribution or thought to say to each other's presentations? No? Okay, fantastic. Let's move straight on to questions then. Lena Dominelli has raised a number of really interesting contributions and reflections to your presentation. So I encourage you, when you get a minute of headspace, to look in the chat. But one question that she asked is, can someone say something about the additional risks that humanitarian workers face when actually in the field working with victim survivors? Many of these are similar. For example, fear of more damage being caused in aftershocks as helping people in the immediate relief stage, and the implications of this for workers' safety and mental health short and long term. And she goes on to talk a little bit more, expand on that example. So I wonder if one of you, perhaps starting with Larissa, might want to say something about the additional risks that humanitarian workers face in the field.
Sure. I mean, that's, I think, a huge and area of growing awareness, I guess, is what are the psychological costs for the helpers. I mean, this discussion has been going on for 15 years or more, but I think it's really only gotten more traction more recently, particularly for those whose families are directly affected by crisis, and who are working to help others, but then also are directly affected themselves. And how do we support people long, even after they've left? What is our duty of care to individuals whose lives are irrevocably affected by the response work that they do, the effects of which can last years afterward. So in my work on violence against aid workers, I've spoken to many who have left many who have left the sector because of trauma and mental health issues. So I think it's a hugely important thing. There is some growing research on it. And I think there are more efforts to do that more effectively, but I also think we have a long way to go. And just to say thanks so much, Belen, and Mihir for your presentations, which were very different than mine, but in many ways, I agree with a lot of what you said. So I'm looking forward to more discussion.
Thanks, Larissa. I wonder if you might say, so I'm going to ask the same question about additional risks that humanitarian workers face to Belen and Mihir in the two contexts that you work on with. But in your work with humanitarian researchers, what are the, using the concept earlier from Thea's presentation about humanitarian care, what kind of structures of care are there for workers while they're out in the field, and when they come back, what kind of model is the typical one that's operated in international NGOs, for example?
I think it varies from organization to organization, at least in my experience. There's, I think some organizations have a lot of everything from, say, trauma counseling and after incident care. I think most organizations have that in place. But I think for me, it's the sort of post-care issues that are the really crucial ones, and also the most difficult, because in many cases you have short-term contracts. And so then what is the humanitarian care that should be available to people after they've left an organization? Because sometimes the effects of this kind of work only surface years later. And I guess that to me is where those issues are much less clear. I think you can argue there is a duty of care, of humanitarian care for the workers themselves that exists in those contexts, but legally, so there's a moral duty, but the legal duty is not necessarily so clear cut. And then how do you mesh those two and actually support that kind of assistance long after people have departed? Yeah, but interestingly, many years ago, I did a study looking at I spoke about some of the lesser kinds of violence or incidents that aren't tracked as clearly and perhaps have a cumulatively greater effect. And for me, one of those, in doing a survey of aid workers that came out very strongly, was work culture and how that can actually create all sorts of mental health issues, I guess, or even just dissatisfaction and difficulties for people in the field working in crisis contexts. So I think work culture and workplace environments can also be an issue, again, that we don't pay as much attention to, that can have long-lasting effects.
Definitely, and there's also questions of equity of access of kind of care facilities within organisations, as well as Absolutely. With the localisation agenda, work gets subcontracted down to local partners, but maybe those structures of care don't translate across. Excellent, thank you. Belen, would you like to have a quick response to the question about additional risks that humanitarian workers face in the field?
I think one of the main issues that we face, that I've observed, is the lack of accountability of the institutions that you work with. So sometimes the workers also face or recognize instances of corruption or working in illegal ways from the agency itself. And in this case in particular, it's the ministry or the government itself. So how do you recognize that something is being done in incorrect ways, and what channels then can you face or go to be able to fix those problems? And many times you basically are stuck, because if you say something, you're going to lose your job. You're not going to be able to help the people, and then you may actually feel prosecution or other instances in which you are no longer able to work for the municipality or the government in general. So in that sense, going back to like the mental health, is also like, how do you, is there like an instance, international instance that oversees this? And it's the whole issue of the United Nations not being able to intervene in cases where it's like the national sovereignty that prevails. But at the same time, then who observes that this situation is being, that the whole project is being done in a fair manner, and who the beneficiaries are. So going back to Dr. Batt's intervention as well, I think that is one of the main challenges, that you feel helpless in some of the cases, and the channels to overcome them are not clear or simply do not exist.
Accountability coming up as a kind of key. I was going to use the word buzzword, but perhaps that's a bit ungenerous. Buzzword of the session today. I saw Thea nodding furiously as well at that moment. Mahir, do you want to make an intervention in response to the additional risks humanitarian workers face when working in the field in the India context?
Yes, yes, please. And first, the additional risk is related to tracking. That now it's far more easy to track a humanitarian worker or a researcher in terms of where he is and what he's doing and what she is eating and where she's spending her money, so on and so forth. Who did she call? And what did they actually discuss than it was before. And I can see that, in fact, one has seen that being used against organizations and individuals already. So there are a lot of advantages of social media and communication and digital technology, but it's also being used for controlling and silencing what's happening on the ground. May it be something related to protests, may it be something related to alternative vision about the development or actual disaster per se as well. The second risk that one sees is they being neutralized in terms of their views and ideas, and not only in terms of directly being told, but the whole ambiance and environment is created by which you feel the peer pressure, which is not real peer, but sort of quote unquote fake peer pressure, so that you want to change your ideas to something which is more sort of fixing into the social group, WhatsApp group, so on and so forth. So that's another sort of risk that is being third is the risk of delayed impact. And all of this is very much here and now technology. And so if the risk is not here and now, it doesn't exist. But actually, some of the things that we do, the impact is much later, after a month, after 3 months, 6 months. And that risk, we don't even know what those risks are when the humanitarian workers and researchers actually are in the field. So as an alternative, what is coming up from various discussions, from interagency dialogues at a district level and at a state level, there are 2 or 3 points related to responding to this risk. And one is that there is hardly ever talk about organizing solidarity, unions of humanitarian workers and researchers. And that's something IDEA needs more thinking about. That how do you organize people who are doing the relief and rehabilitation work in different places? Second is the short-term contract is something which is very convenient to everybody at the cost of a large number of people on the ground. And there has to be some sort of a retainer fee that is offered to the person when there is no jumping into action. So during that period, because the humanitarian worker or researcher has families, they have to feed themselves, feed the family. So some sort of retainership, some basic income that they should have when they are not actually in the field or active, quote unquote. And third is some sort of protection, because in other jobs, when you retire, you have pension and you have something to take back, you have something to rest on, and humanitarian workers not. Of course, humanitarian workers don't go to do humanitarian work because they are looking for economic comfort, etc., etc. But in the end, their life cycle is same as any other human life cycles. So these are the welfare benefits that any worker will get, humanitarian worker doesn't get, and that discussion is not there. So that would be very important as a mitigation of risk that the workers face. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for such detailed and reflective responses to the question and other interjections. I'm quite conscious of time. We've got about 7 minutes left, and we've got tons of questions. So I'm going to separate them and ping them at particular panelists, if you'll forgive the arbitrary nature of this. So a question from Josh, which I'll pass to Larissa. On the note of digitalization of humanitarianism, do you see a place for cryptocurrencies in providing a decentralized currency with which to gift aid in areas that experience financial corruption? Then I will ask, then after Larissa's response to that, I'll ask Chiara's question to Belen. So do you think technology could be used as a democratic tool to decolonize knowledge, and so consequently humanitarian work in general? And perhaps if you've got any examples of that you might have seen in practice. And then an anonymous question, which I will then pass to Mihir, which is responding to Mihir's points about the economic system preventing sustainable growth. And the question is, do the rising calls for degrowth provide a solution for sustainable humanitarian aid, or are they just wishful thinking? So you've got a bit of time to reflect on those. Larissa, cryptocurrencies.
Okay, I actually ended up a couple of years ago writing a report on blockchain and distributed ledger technology in the humanitarian sector. There are some examples actually of cryptocurrencies being used. I do think that some organizations accept cryptocurrencies and as part of, a way to donate to their organizations. So there definitely are those possibilities. Also, there are models of perhaps using cryptocurrency, but not necessarily. Models of actually directly giving assistance to people who are affected by disaster. But I would also say there's a lot of caveats to this. The sort of the use of cryptocurrency within or in terms of programming does not really exist there, or at least to my knowledge, it doesn't. There might be some small pilot examples. There are some uses of distributed ledger technologies, but there's all sorts of, I guess, challenges and also pitfalls in doing that. So we haven't yet seen a large scale change with that. So we might get there in future, but we are not there yet. And I think there's a lot of both ethical and practical considerations that we haven't fully considered. I'll end there. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Belen, do you want to respond to the question about technology being a tool to decolonize knowledge?
I think there's multiple instances of technology. So for instance, we work with appropriate technology. So it's like low-tech technologies that are produced with local materials, local knowledge, like the case we've seen with rainwater collection systems and solar panels. And I guess in that sense, those kind of technologies could promote, I don't want to use the buzzwords of like empowerment, but like at least different ways of governing and different ways of producing spaces that provide services and infrastructure that are needed and like are pertinent for the local context. But I guess like technologies could also be understood in, or we're talking about cryptocurrencies, social media, etc. I guess like the main question is like who controls, who manages, and who participates in the production or in the use of those technologies. If, for instance, it remains in a circle of trust of communities using technologies to maintain or govern or produce commons, then it is a positive instance. If it's being used for surveillance by the state or by other agencies to limit the participation and the sense of ownership or identity of certain groups, then it is not productive. So I don't have like a clear answer for this, but it's more about then who is it used by and for what purposes, and if it does allow greater participation or not from the people without jeopardizing their security in the future.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right to raise the fact that technology is not a monolith. It's so diverse, and so need to be on the same page when we're referring to different different aspects of it. And I think your question about who controls or manages the technology in question and sets accountability is really key here. And Mihir, I'll go to you in a second just to respond to the degrowth question, but I know we've only got a couple of minutes left, and I don't think we're going to get to all of the questions. So I'd ask just Thea while Mihir is answering his question. I'd like to ask his question at the end about how, if you can speak on behalf of the humanitarian community, how they plan to tackle financial abuses, like the example you gave of the COVID-19 expenditures. So I'll come to you at the end. Mihir, please, your thoughts on degrowth as a solution for sustainable humanitarian aid.
I think degrowth is a very good idea to be examined by the humanitarian sector researchers and workers, and should look at more carefully. And not only degrowth, because in a way disasters, humanitarian crises do actually slow down, if not disrupt and stop growth. So there is an opportunity that growth has somehow been hampered. So let us not get back to the same. But I think there is more thinking needed. But there is also the idea behind degrowth is of regrowth, that what are the sectors that need to regrow faster and better. For example, the growth after disaster should be employment-led, growth after disaster should be decentralized growth after disaster should be broad-based, and where 99% of the people benefit and not 1% which owns a large number of capital. So I think that with the idea of degrowth is very important to look at in the coming months. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. So we've got a number of, for any students here who are looking to study or are studying humanitarian studies, concepts of regrowth, humanitarian care and digitalization as risk to take forward in your research. Thea, if I can pass to you to answer Alex's question about whether the humanitarian community have plans to tackle financial abuses, particularly around COVID-19.
Jessica, I'm very sorry, I don't have an answer to this. I don't know what is going on inside the humanitarian sector. And the problem is, if I look at, for example, what happened in the Netherlands, the humanitarian sector has not been involved. That was one of my critiques. I was, asking publicly, I mean, I'm not invited to speak or something, but publicly I asked our government, why didn't you consult the Red Cross and other humanitarian actors to deal with the administration and the management of this crisis in the Netherlands? Why was this going so completely wrong and clumsy and amateurish and reinventing every single wheel? So I think the humanitarian sector has been largely marginalized from all these discussions, to be honest. Now, if I abuse the power that my microphone is open, I just wanted to say one little thing here, that the discussion here is so fascinating, and I realized we have many students in the room, we have many young scholars in the room, and I just wanted to throw at you this extremely important concept of the everyday politics. And it has come across now in so many ways that we cannot speak of technology as, being good or being wrong or being something or being another. I mean, there's of course a tendency to approach these questions normatively, but let's please also research the everyday politics. How does it work? How does technology actually, what is the social life of technology? How does it affect allocation? How does it affect access? How does it affect distribution of resources? And that is a vast area of research, which we should also approach a little bit open-minded to see what is happening on the ground, and then from there bring on our conclusions and ideas. I love this whole idea of degrowth. It is also where notions come from around care, not just as care of humanitarian care, but care as it should be, which is a core concept of how we organize our lives and how we organize our societies and how we organize our economies. it's a very far-fetched reality, unfortunately, with small-scale experiments and pilots here and there and the other. So I'm afraid we will have to keep engaging with the big economies. I'm very glad with the lesson. I don't mean it's denigrating. I mean, it's very positive. I learned much from the analysis of the neoliberal economy of that Mihir was telling us, and the complete failure of the neoliberal economy to shape the type of system that would actually help people. This is it. Very abrupt ending, but it was very.
I think you might have frozen a little bit at the end, but thank you so much, Thea. That was excellent. So we all have an action point to go ahead and continue research in everyday politics. And I think there's consensus on the panel. I saw everyone nodding there as you raised this concept and this theme. Well, I think that brings we're at 12:34 now. I think that brings our panel to a close. Thank you so much, everyone, for your excellent participations, your interjections, Larissa, Belen, Mihir, and Thea. They're really, really valuable. More questions you might want to type a response to in the Q&A if you get a minute. But I'd like everyone else to join us and give a round of applause and say thank you to our panelists for their time and their expertise. Thank you. I know it's difficult when you're not in a room to feel the nice atmosphere afterwards, but I know everyone's clapping along. That ends our morning session, and we now break until 2 o'clock. But do join us in the afternoon for a session that is hosted by my colleague, Dr. Virginie Lemasson, discussing the climate, gender and security nexus. Have a great lunch break and see you on the other side. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jessica.